it's a pleasure to be here. You know, I've given more than 1,000 lectures in my time, but I can honestly say this is the first time I've spoken to an all-women's university. So you'll forgive me if I am a little discombobulated. But you have a beautiful campus, and it's been a pleasure and a privilege to visit. And so I want to talk about a book that I co-authored with a British social theorist by the name of Ian Wilkinson. And the book has as the title, A Passion for Society, How We Think About Human Suffering. And this lecture is called A Passion for Society, Social Suffering, Social Science, and Social Care. And although I'm going to go through some slides that give substance to the book and what it's about, the points are, the main thrust of the argument is very straightforward. So at its inception, when it began, systematic social inquiry, which we can call social science, begins with great figures of the Western liberal tradition in the UK and Europe. Adam Smith, for example, would be seen as one of these progenitors. John Stuart Mill in England, Voltaire in France, and many, many others. And at its inception, their understanding of what social science should be or could be was that, like medicine, it would improve people's lives. So their idea was, well, medicine deals with individuals. Social sciences deal with the social, understanding society. But the purpose was to improve society, improve people's lives. And from the onset of systematic social inquiry, social suffering and health disparities and social disparities and the social sources and consequences, particularly poverty, but all the different social sources and consequences, racism, social injuries of a variety of kinds, from stigmatization to marginalization and what have you. All of these were the basis for improving society. That is, it began with social problems. Now, over time, as social science developed, it lost its way. And when it came to this originating focus on societal reform and the improvement of human conditions. And over time, social scientists came to insist that they studied society for its own sake and did it in a scientific way that objectivized human beings and distanced the scientists, the social scientists, from the investigative reporters, novelists, and other critics of social life who they saw as not distant enough from the subject matter. Now, I'm going to make the case here that studying society for its own sake today is untenable. And if social science continues to do this, there will be no social science 50 years from now. And I am merely picking up from a long tradition of social scientists, a long tradition of internal and external critics, including Max Weber, C. Wright Mills, Franz Boas, Margaret Mead, Ferdinand Tonez, Jane Addams, William James, John Dewey, Hannah Arendt, and many others, all of whom challenged the scientizing ideology of social science and demanded an accountable social science that, like medicine, would seek to help people. And you see some pictures of the social scientists up there, and you actually have up there a Korean American who's one of my students, one of my former students, Jim Kim, who's now president of the World Bank, but who wrote a book called Dying for Growth, which was a fundamental critique of what the bank was doing in the 80s and the 90s, that were, in his view, and in many views, ruining people's lives. So the book basically follows the critiques of people from within. The global circulation of knowledge about bodily, mental, moral, and social suffering has highlighted the potential of the social sciences to contribute to many urgent issues. So this is what should be, in my view, the aspiration for social science. And it certainly is the possible agenda of social science, looking at substance abuse, human trafficking, refugee trauma, environmental health crises, epidemics of emerging diseases, unmet needs of the elderly, common mental disorders, and you could go on and on and on and on. Oops. The founding vision of social science, somewhere along the line, became occluded through the professionalization of social inquiry and its institutionalization in universities. Today, the values and imperatives shaping the conduct of academic social science are perhaps more disposed than ever toward making it, and this is, if you follow the English, this is meant to be a strong statement, making it morally sterile, practically worthless, and void of human passion. In particular, the market imperatives governing neoliberal universities and the purely utilitarian standards that dictate the terms of value on academic achievement are militantly opposed to the nurturing of social understanding as a commitment to human care and the promotion of humane society. So this is a critique I'm making of the way our universities function. This trend continues. Universities are turning away from humanities and social science and are instead emphasizing applied sciences, engineering, as well as basic science and technology. The global revolution in information technology has added further pressure with its emphasis on the management of packaged knowledge. And if you remember, or maybe many of you don't know, but Claude Shannon in the 1940s, a great American engineer, foresaw the engineering of knowledge. And he said yes, and he kicked off the IT revolution. And Shannon said, knowledge can be engineered, but to be engineered, it must be stripped of its meaning. Okay? So it basically, what he said is, you will engineer information as opposed to knowledge. Now, if we focus on suffering, we see a countercurrent. Important disruptions and counter-movements are taking place now and have for some time, and many of them originate from the problem of suffering. The radical introspection that often accompanies experiences of suffering can catalyze wider questions of the social and cultural circumstances in which we are made to live. Indeed, encounters with experiences of human pain and misery often give rise to an urgency to make the social component of our lives an explicit object of critical inquiry and moral concern. It's often suggested that modernity desensitizes us to suffering. Yet in many social arenas and cultural contexts, the experience of human suffering today attracts an unprecedented amount of moral attention and public concern. Just look at what's on the television. Despite institutional arrangements that dispose us to think and act without feeling for others, we continue to be emotionally and morally invested in the well-being of strangers. Now, obviously, the worldwide contestation today over the plight of refugees and immigrants shows the tension in this domain. Historically and across all cultures, human suffering has been identified as a limit condition through which to apprehend some of the most basic truths about our state of being and place in the world. Due to the vulnerability of the human, that is, we're all vulnerable to so many different things. If I listed them, you and I would exit here completely demoralized. We tend to take the impossibility of retreat from suffering as a bitter guide to self and social understanding. Experiences that entail the most terrible uprooting of life often bring us to reach out for what really matters in our lives. And those of you who've had to deal with suffering in the family know something about this. That makes suffering an intensely moral experience, one laden with value and reflective on value conflicts. This recognition of suffering as moral experience is vital for the analyses of social meaning and bounds of human suffering. Suffering issues a demand not only for critical scrutiny, but also for amelioration, ameliorative actions to oppose the harms it does to people. So the analytic frame of social suffering, and here, by the way, in this person is Wordsworth, the great English poet, who was the one who coined the term social suffering, underscores the fact that social life takes its place in enactments of substantive human values. It treats social suffering as a dynamic element within wider processes of social and cultural change, and as a circumstance in which these might be apprehended in terms of their human effects. It involves situations in which a great deal is at stake for people, and demands that social understanding be attentive to the dilemmas of moral experience. It invites inquiry of how people's suffering is caused and conditioned by society. Just think of all the work that has gone into poverty and poverty reduction. It is designed to document how the character of society is exposed through the incidents of suffering, including by documenting forms of social experience that determine how suffering takes place and the effects it has on people. It also views evidence of human suffering as grounds on which to make our social state of being a matter for critical and moral inquiry. Social suffering highlights the involvement of lived experience in research and thinking. And this demands critical examination of traditions of ontology and epistemology as they pertain to the contribution of human experiences of social life to the conceptualization and analysis of public affairs. It also requires that we declare a standpoint with regard to claims that we witness suffering to which we may contribute, that we witness in order to contribute. It is part of a wider movement within sociology and anthropology that holds embodied experience as a mirror to society and as primary material for sociological and anthropological investigation. And social suffering calls for efforts to devise practices and terms that are suited to account for conditions shaped by social injustice and inequality. And here, a focus on health is very important and frames the way that the social world affects the body, and that suffering is a perfect example of this. While attempting to understand the moral calamity of human catastrophe, social suffering is also a register of political and economic processes that cause people harm. It invites study both of how current forms of suffering contribute to contemporary social and interpersonal change, and of how past experiences affect the present. Social suffering emphasizes the ways in which bodily experiences of pain and distress are conditioned by social context. This often serves to expose how structural violence plays a part within the social distribution of many forms of bodily disease and mental illness, and for this to be made materially evident in the limits set for people's health. Bodily afflictions are analyzed in terms of what they reveal about a person's social and material conditions of existence, and are treated as a platform from which to initiate critical inquiries into the structural formations of societies and the institutional exercise of power, and how power grinds people. This approach to social inquiry requires a response of care and caregiving as forms of action on and in the world, or as work that sustains life. So social suffering calls forth the idea that care is not only a response to people who suffer, but it's actually a way of studying them. And so social suffering brings social science to examine its contribution to the development of humane forms of society. This raises the possibility that social science might be repositioned as a project of critical humanism. Such a project would stand opposed to forms of essentialism and reductionism that diminish our appreciation for the variety of human conditions, but unite its practitioners in a commitment to understand how our capacity to recognize the suffering borne by others can be nurtured as the common ground on which to establish principles of human rights and practices of care. I think this repeats pretty much what I've said. So we see social science as a kind of ameliorative practice. So one of the things we try to do in this book, Wilkinson and I, is to reframe, reimagine social inquiry as the enactment of substantive values and as a moral commitment to building more humane forms of society. And this involves the cultivation of what we call a humanitarian social imaginary and a commitment to humanitarian social reform. So we're making this statement at exactly the time that anthropology, for example, is launching a critique of humanitarian reasoning and practices. We're defending humanitarianism in this book. Also crucial is the care perspective. It is through the act of caring for others, we argue in this book, that we stand to grasp how social life is made possible and sustained. And the inadequate care provided to vulnerable and disadvantaged groups exposes the human costs of contemporary power relationships and how social organization contributes to social suffering. The value of social science should be sought in its involvement in the promotion of real acts of care in society. Problems of social suffering bring the practice of social science to encompass open expressions of moral worth and political aspiration. This demands that empirical social research be valued both as a means to bring the evidence of lived experience to bear upon theoretical terms of analysis and as a reflexive process whereby practitioners are sensitized towards the moral values and political investments that shape their professional conduct. Social suffering thus invites questioning of the meanings and moral worth of academic work and the formal processes whereby problems of human life are adopted as scholarly concerns. So this book is meant to be a thorough critique of academic work in the social sciences. And what purpose does it have? Addressing problems of social suffering, we aver, involves more than a drive to expose the social causes and distribution of the harms that are done to people. That in itself is important. It requires an effort to make explicit the conditions under which knowledge of society is produced and sanctioned as a legitimate basis for public debate and policy concern. There's the very way we produce knowledge of society, we're saying, has to be organized from a care perspective around social suffering, as opposed from the removed idea that somehow we're neutral scientists simply commenting on the way things are. It involves us in critically reappraising the methods and techniques that are deployed under the effort to extend the boundaries of human insight and social care. Now, Medicine, too, has widened its gaze to make social aspects of illness and treatment more central to the practice of the doctor, and to make prevention as well as treatment more central to medical care. This is a major change in medicine in our time. But medicine as a profession has also had its problems. Paradoxically, while defending the importance of caregiving to the profession, if you look at the time spent on care in the curriculum and in working with patients, it's become less and less and less. So it's not like medicine is free of this issue. It has a problem too. The experience of suffering of patients, as articulated through patient complaints, has become less significant for care than the disease categories and the entity of disease itself, and the high-tech interventions that go with it. Caregiving is under threat, and critics have warned that care could be lost entirely. That is, this should be a wake-up call to you, your generation. You take it for granted that there's care in society, but there's no reason to suspect that care will continue in society. Now, we suggest a number of ways that social science and medicine can work together. And we emphasize this humanitarian social imaginary, that our imagination should be about the awful situations of people and how we could improve those. This does not mean that we cannot critique humanitarian assistance programs. We should and we must. But one must not give up on the effort. That is, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Just because some NGOs fail doesn't mean that the whole humanitarian effort is wrong. So we're arguing that we must practice and advance a care perspective in social science. It is through the act of caring for others, and this we mean in a broad sense, both the actual physical acts of care and the emotional acts of care, and broader in the social imaginary of thinking about caring for a social group. The inadequate care provided to vulnerable and socially disadvantaged groups exposes the human costs of contemporary power relations. The value of social science should be sought in its involvement in the promotion of real acts of care in society. Let me just say that again. This is exactly what the book is arguing for. The value of social science should be sought in its involvement in the promotion of real acts of care in society. Caregiving can be viewed as the social glue of a society. Actually, it's very appropriate that I'm delivering this before an audience principally of women. Because who does caregiving in society? Principally women in all societies. And that's becoming tougher and tougher as women enter into the workforce, as they themselves have less time, as the demands are greater, not just the demands of child rearing, but the demands of caring for elderly parents, et cetera. So caregiving really is the social glue that keeps us going in society. Yet it is rendered invisible. We take it for granted. This is the basic social glue of society. You go to any kind of parliamentary meeting, any kind of political meeting of governing bodies, you'll almost never hear caregiving mentioned. We take it for granted. We relegate it to the domestic space, and we don't recognize it as a public concern. So caregiving needs to be reinvigorated as a source of social knowledge, an element of social care, and a site for reforming professional and family practices. A focus on the doing of care and the importance of it in reciprocity and presence frame caregiving not only as a social value, but also as a practice that is indispensable to social understanding. That is, our argument is, if you don't take care as central to your project, you cannot understand the social world. Caregiving thus serves as a method for understanding how social life is made possible, how it's sustained, and what its potential for human flourishing is. Caregiving stands to offer moral and practical wisdom for the art of living. Now, we don't talk today about the art of living. You guys, I don't know how you're trained at, this is a great university, UI University, but the way that we used to train students was not only to advance your cognitive knowledge, but to advance your moral development. And that moral development was about becoming good citizens and also about the art of living, how to live your lives. Now it's very difficult to get the idea I'm trying to advance now. It's not that I want you to think of care as one human being caring for another human being. I want you to think of it as social care, that is caring for our world, caring for our society. Care extended to society itself, care for major social problems. So dealing with the substance abuse in your friends, but also dealing with it as a problem in society. Dealing with the suicide of a particular adolescent, but also dealing with the social problem of adolescent suicide. Dealing with violence to a particular woman, but also thinking about violence toward women generally in society. There's also care of memories, and I want to suggest this is one of the most important things that happens in social life. There's a wonderful book by Connerton, for those of you who are interested, called How Societies Remember. Connerton says they remember in three ways. They remember through cultural myths and memorials. They remember through rituals. And they remember through embodiment. And that embodiment is the carrying of memories. That's what you will do when you get older and your parents pass and you try to connect to the past. You'll keep your memories of them and bring them forward to help organize your life. What would happen to society if a caregiving approach were not just in the domains we're comfortable with, but were extended outward? How about care in the place of security studies, or immigration, or the political process itself? Would we change our ideas because of that approach? I think we would, in very fascinating ways. So to revitalize caregiving in a number of domains, I want to give the example of medicine. And what we need to do in medicine is to incentivize caregiving, to educate doctors better in core skills, to go beyond bureaucratic protocols and algorithms to actual caregiving activities, to morally train physicians that caregiving is central to what their task is, to complement the economic language of healthcare with a clinical language that would elevate care. We need to revitalize caregiving in families. We need to provide the resources, financial and cognitive, because this is where most care occurs. Most care in societies, every society in the world, is in families. Yet it's not recompensed, it's not compensated. It's uncompensated, okay? We need to provide the resources, financial and cognitive, so families can continue to do this. And there's a crisis in long-term care funding, which is a crisis of elder care that all societies have to deal with and will be dealing for the next decade or two. Neoliberalism, I believe, and many of my colleagues believe, is a fundamental challenge to caregiving. That is because the argument of neoliberalism is that free markets take care of themselves, and that we're all individuals anyway, and we want the freedom of the individual to participate in the market. It's nonsense. None of us is individuals. We all are tied with families, with networks, with groups. Even if we live alone, our engagement is always with others. So revitalizing care in society involves education and support for a social care ethic. I don't think we do a very good job on this. You can look at my own society and in its demoralizing present condition. Institutional and bureaucratic reform that emphasizes care needs to occur. So the care, alongside efficiency and rationality, it's not just rationality and efficiency, it's care that matters as well. Provision of resources for the various levels of caregiving: humanitarian, professional, self-care, family and network care, folk and religious caregiving. Social care must be understood in extremely practical, not utopian terms. Practical examples of care are welfare programs, community-based mutual assistance, including spiritual and religious communities, humanitarian assistance, the practice of social science in the model of Jane Addams. How many people have ever heard of Jane Addams in this room? Anybody ever heard of her? Okay. So Jane Addams was the most important American pragmatist. More important than William James, more important than John Dewey. She was the pragmatist at the turn of the 19th. She's the only social scientist to have won a Nobel Prize. Okay? She won a Nobel Prize for Peace. She created a phenomenon called Hull House, in which she went to live with poor women in Chicago. She was a sociologist, and the chairman of her department, a very famous sociologist by the name of Park, he was creating modern sociology. It would come out of the University of Chicago sociology department. He wanted Hull House to be a laboratory, a social laboratory. She completely refused. She said, this is not a laboratory. A laboratory is where you work on things that you treat at a distance. This is my close experience with my friends. These are my friends. I'm working with them to improve their lives and mine. She created modern social work, Jane Addams. She created the whole idea behind the community development movements. She's an enormously important woman. I might just leave this because this is more anthropological and we can talk about this afterward. So what's the gist of what I'm saying? I'm saying that there's a crisis in our world. And the crisis is not only our social problems that we face. The crisis is in the very institution that you are part of, the academy, the International Academy, universities. Today we're seeing that universities increasingly are being asked to value simply cognitive development, especially as it relates to engineering and applied science. That means that the moral dimensions of universities, the training of people to be citizens, the training of citizens to the central moral issues is left behind. Hence, in your own training, it's not good enough just to have a class on ethics. It's not good enough to think about care just in the medical domain. We're suggesting that in anything that involves the social world, care has got to be central. The idea of care has got to be central. And while we don't want to diminish the significance of care on the individual level, we want to emphasize the whole concept of social care on the societal level. And here the great German-American political scientist, Hannah Arendt, really ran with this idea. She was the first one to say that the central contribution of 19th and 20th century social science was the figuration of the social, the idea that there were things beyond individuals, that there was the social, there was society, and that figuration means that problems and solutions have got to be seen on that level. And we're just upping the ante on care and saying that care has to occur also as a kind of social care for society. So with that my friends, I will end my talk, and I'm open for questions.